Hi, I'm Rachel Lancaster, and this is the Magnificent Midlife Podcast. This is where we celebrate women in midlife and beyond. We challenge the status quo and bash those negative stereotypes about being an older woman. We're not over the hill at 40, 50, 60. We're just getting started. And the world needs us now more than ever. I'll be talking all things midlife, about issues that matter, and sharing fabulous stories of amazing women doing very cool stuff. Now's our time. I'm delighted today to introduce you to Iffat Shahnaz. Now, Iffat is a lifelong campaigner committed to social justice and equality. She works with progressive organisations that are committed to social change and tackling social exclusion and discrimination. And she specialises in gender-based violence, community education, facilitation, service development and change management. Iffat, I'm delighted to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Rachel, for inviting me. And it's interesting to hear myself being described with these words, because there's also a part of me that thinks, oh, I do other things as well.
This is all that I know. You can tell me about all the other things as well as we progress. But why don't we start? Tell me, how did you come to be doing what you do?
I've been thinking about this a lot. I think my early years and my late parents are hugely influential in my life in lots of ways. And I would like to share their story because it's kind of made me who I am. And also, since they've passed away, made me also realize I always want to take the best of them with me in every areas of my life. So my dad came to Britain in the early 60s. And like my mom, he was a child of partition. So when India and Pakistan became independent in 1947, I think my mom and dad were roughly about 13, 14 years old. And I say roughly because they didn't really keep a record of people's birthdays at that point in time. They lived in a very, very rural part of what is now still in Indian Punjab. And they had very different experiences being, a young woman at that time and a young man. And I think there was something in their story when they shared with me. And I think partition is something really important for my generation, who are second generation. We are the children of immigrants, from the former Commonwealth, who were invited into Britain to work, basically, and saw it as a new opportunity. And it's a very moving story, and I probably get a little bit upset talking about it, if that's, and I'm not going to hide that. But it's also so when that happened during partition, it was a very bloody time in history, and it was never talked about very much by either of my parents. But as we got older, I would kind of reflect on some of the stories I used to overhear them say at that time, and both of their experiences were quite traumatic in some ways. And I think that trauma stayed with them. And I think that had a big impact on me in terms of wanting to contribute to, I suppose it's very ideal, but I really do believe in it, the world a better place for everybody and not for some people. And that is very much from their experiences at that time, because my dad's family had to leave the village they've been living in for probably centuries, actually, and were kind of escorted, were protected by the other villagers there, because at that time it was starting to get very violent. And a similar experience for my mom, who was also at that time, I would say, honestly, a child bride. She was married. She had been married partly due to alleviate and get the family out of a very poor family out of poverty. So that's something I do want to share. And she must have been quite young, but I don't know how old, maybe 13, 14. And what they did then was, and I don't want to kind of stereotype a whole group of people, but what they did then at that time was they would have a religious ceremony, but they wouldn't necessarily be man and wife. So they were kind of married in the eyes of God, but there wasn't any in terms of living together, because partition happened. And I actually think, looking back on it, that was a good thing for my mom, because she ended up marrying my dad. But at that time, so there was all that. So once partition happened and they were in Pakistan, and moms, and I do want to say something about that time, because it was called, when they were leaving the villages and like being almost protected by the people living there, who were other Hindu families who'd probably been there for generations, and Sikh families. So there was a kind of kinship and a sense of community there. Looking back on it, and also, reflecting on it and reading and speaking to other people, as well as my parents, the villagers described it as the rola, which means noise. So they heard all this noise and all this commotion, because I went back to those villages in 2012 to go back to where they were born. And I was the first family member since 1947 to go back to India, and the first woman. And, I am, too, because we wanted to see where they grew up and their place of birth. And from that, when I was speaking to the people there, because we met people that knew, not my parents, but their siblings and their parents and aunts and uncles, they described it as being the rola. And that was very profound, and that's had a very profound impact on me, because what that meant was noise. But yet that generation were very silent about their experiences. So for me, that's their experiences have been very formative and character building in terms of why I've chosen, and I have made choices to stay active in the work that I do, whether I'm paid for it, whether I'm voluntary. But I'm absolutely determined to fight inequality in whatever ways and shapes I see it, hear it, and feel it.
And it feels to me so sad to sort of hear that story of refugees in a way, because they were fleeing from trauma, fleeing from violence. And we have the issues today with refugees fleeing in the same way, but they don't have somewhere to flee to. And it's getting so much more difficult to flee anywhere. And it's such a difficult scenario, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think there's something very much in, what you've shared, Rachel, around safe passage and safety. I think that's huge when you are experiencing, displacement. I mean, that was an internally displaced movement. I think it affected 1 million people. And thousands were killed and thousands died due to whatever kind of communalism or religious hatred or political, gains were to be made at that time. And it's really interesting how it impacted on my parents, because my dad, I mean, I appreciate I'm sharing stuff that might be upsetting, but I do want to share it because I think it's important, because it's actually people's experiences. He was very determined for my sister and I to learn how to swim, which we were like, okay, very determined. But the story was really quite, you have to learn to swim. We were like, okay, yeah, but we did. And we grew up in a part of Tipton in the West Midlands where we could, it was at school and there were local swimming baths. And it was like, why, Dad? In a way, why? And it was because he saw people jump into rivers to flee during partition and drown. I mean, it's profound.
And now you've got the boat people trying to get across the channel.
Yeah, and I think there is something in that within me about making those parallels constantly throughout life. Well, actually, had it not been, and then also, just to kind of share about full circle about my mum and dad's meeting, because that, obviously led to us coming here. Dad had 6 other brothers. And I think, so he was a family of 7, 6 living at the time. But it was my grandmother who was, his mother, an extraordinary woman. Because at that time, Mom had been divorced. So there was a huge, and I think it must have been late 30s, late 1940s, possibly early 50s. Because they didn't keep a record of time in the same way that we do now, which I kind of like as well. But there's also a part of me that's curious, like, what happened then? Where were you living? What did you look like? Because they didn't have cameras, so they couldn't take photographs. So there's all this stuff you kind of weaving in my own mind, what they looked like, what were they wearing, those sort of stories one creates. But just, so my mom So when my dad went to see my mom with his mom, it was an arranged marriage because they were arranged marriages. She said, you're going to, this, young woman has been divorced. We don't discriminate. You're going to marry her. So that's how it happened. So they got married.
Wow, that was really enlightened, wasn't it?
They got married, So, and then I think they then moved to Karachi in Pakistan. And then Dad moved, I think late 50s, but early 60s possibly, to England. And the whole family helped him save up for his airfare. So that's that. And then he saved up, and it took him nearly 4 years for him to save up for my mum and my brother, the eldest sibling. My brother was born in Pakistan, for them to come here. 4 years it took. To Tipton, West Midlands.
Now, you see, when you started talking about your time in Tipton, West Midlands, I heard a slight West Midlands twang, and I thought you were from Scotland.
Yeah.
You are now in Scotland, aren't you? Is that right?
We moved there the Tipton years were I would say my formative years. I lived there till I was 13.
Because I'm a Brummie, you see.
I can hear it in your voice a bit.
Can you? Yeah, I can hear a little bit in you, and you can hear a little bit in me.
So the Tipton years, Dad worked very in the kind of in a factory. And Mum was the homemaker, housewife, very busy, obviously doing lots of looking after all of us. But it was also, I've got two amazing siblings, elder brother and elder sister, who I witnessed and observed as 10 years between my brother and I, and about 6 between my sister. So they're like these glamorous teenagers through my eyes. And they were very active. My brother was very active in that time in the 70s in the campaign to end nuclear disarmament. Mm-hmm. So he's very active there. And my sister became active, both of them did, because that was at the time of the National Front. And that time there was they did experience a lot of racial harassment and abuse. My sister and I did. Sorry, my brother and I, my sister and my brother did, I beg your pardon, at that time. Because that was an increase, and I'm going to just use this word, at a time of Paki bashing. But that's the first time we all felt a sense of otherness, of actually, hang on, I'm born here, my sister's born here, my brother's, lives here. He may have been born in Pakistan, but his identity and who he is here. And I think that in terms of informing all the work I've done and all the work I do and will continue to do was very, very impactful. Because for a lot of us, we experience discrimination and racism and sexism, or, that sense of when we're at school. That's the first time for most of us when we're kind of within on an institutional or within that institutional space. This was different. This was on the streets. So and it's actually quite scary. My sister ran home once from a youth club disco because she was being chased by a group of racists. I mean, you could describe them as skinheads, but they were racists during that time.
This was going to be my questions for later, but how do you feel this year, having, seen all the Black Lives Matter movement kicking off again, but this time the world taking rather more notice of it? I mean, my hope is that while we're focusing on specifically Black lives at the moment, that it will have a knock-on effect to all kinds of prejudice. I don't know whether you are perhaps already seeing that or not seeing that, or what. So how has it been to see that this year for you?
I'm actually really, from a great deal of trauma and discrimination and tragedy and institutional, systemic discrimination, I think it's been really, I'm actually very hopeful, because what I've actually witnessed or seen or part of, which was very much, I think, and also we were part of a pandemic, and I don't think we can separate the two, what happened in terms of a movement.
I agree.
Black Lives Matter from the time in Ferguson, which led to the birth of that movement through activists and communities experiencing, I would say, discrimination at the hands of the police, who are there to protect you in one hand, and to a global pandemic. And I think the thought of people being not hemmed in, but under lockdown, which, a global lockdown. I think about a third of the population of the world was under lockdown at that point in time. And in a funny way, we also had a lot more, and I don't say this lightly, time on our hands.
Yes.
There's a lot of time, and we're also living in a very social world, which I think is great as well. And we have generations who are social in terms of who they are, their identity, how people engage, particularly like my nieces and nephews who are around 18, 19 and younger, some of them, they're very progressive. But that's what I feel. Very switched on to different rights, different, people in discrimination faced by people of colour, Black communities, trans, non-binary communities. There's a lot happening out there. So for me, it's almost like a dynamite amplification of what, of kind of global and structural inequalities, and the suffering. And I think there just came a point where it's just like, here we are. And it's very profound because COVID-19 and how some of the symptoms, it really affects the breath, your breathing, your respiratory. Yeah. And yet you've got this man who has, I couldn't watch any, I can't watch that stuff, but I'm aware of it. Is basically, we're watching somebody suffocate to death, and saying, I can't breathe. So something very profound happened in that moment. And it was really interesting because I was talking to some of my friends who are activists, anti-racist activists, or a community of us saying, what's changed? How do we articulate it? And it was very profound because it was during my time and my experiences, silence was survival. So somebody, and I did get it, racially abused me, maybe on the streets, or it was a microaggression. A lot of the time I chose for my own safety not to say anything, Whereas now I saw all these slogans, which basically silence is violence. And I'd never seen that before. Yes. And I was like, wow. So in a way, that kind of group of people who do fight for against all sorts of injustices, want a really progressive change, want the whole system in terms of economic system to be relooked at and resources distributed more equally. The circle just got bigger. So that's where I feel things are at. The circle got much bigger.
I love that analogy. The circle got much bigger. That's brilliant. I love that. I think you're absolutely right. Without COVID, we wouldn't have noticed. Well, non-Black people particularly like myself, white people, wouldn't have noticed this as much as we did, and certainly I did. I mean, I've gone and done some work. I've attended demonstrations with my mask on. I've read some books. I've watched lots of films and videos. I am now much more aware, and it's interesting you talked about silence is violence, because two things. My husband, actually, he went out and he got himself a black T-shirt. I should tell the listeners that before we got on, actually, Iffat she met my husband because we were having a few sound issues, and he came on and sorted us out. But he's got himself, he always wears black T-shirts, but he's got himself a black T-shirt, and he's got a hand with a finger pointing up to his own face on the T-shirt, and underneath it says racist when silent. And he loves to go out on the street and wear this, and I'm quite proud of him, really. Yeah. I think, and people look at his shirt and go, oh, and they take notice of it. And then the other thing is, I've encountered not racism towards me, but racist comments from extended family in the past, and I have not said anything because I didn't want to upset the apple cart. I wouldn't now. I wouldn't not say anything now. I would say something, however uncomfortable it would make me, and it would make me very uncomfortable because it wouldn't go down like a ton of bricks. But I'm hopeful that maybe that kind of comment in the first instance now wouldn't be made again. So I wouldn't have to speak out, but if I did, I would now.
But I think that's really good. And I think through this sense of like books and people's experiences and that sense of agency, isn't it? It's actually like, I have a role in this, and I might need to do more reading, understand like the type of language I use, but I actually choose not to collude with it. And I think there's something at this moment in time about being anti-racist. I'm not a racist, I don't see your color, or you're all the same to me. And we're not, and that's okay. That's actually very important in terms of diversity. That's really, we've got to have a more diverse world. It's more interesting, it's healthier, and we become more confident with it when we're living within it.
Well, one of my guests in the last season that I'd asked on to specifically talk about Black Lives Matter, and Kwabi Agbe, and she'd done a little video about how saying you're colorblind just doesn't work. No. It never did, really, but it certainly doesn't now, saying you don't see color. And she said, if you don't see my color, you don't see me, because this is my color. I am Black, I'm African, I'm proud. And it's such a huge part of me. How can you say you don't see it? So, it just doesn't work. But it's interesting because on this educational journey that I've been on, I've found out that it very much was the narrative in the 70s. When we were growing up, it was not to admit to race in a way. It was to ignore it, to say we're all the same, and we're not all the same. It just doesn't work like that, does it? But acknowledging we're not the same doesn't make us racist.
Exactly. And I think, and it's being confident in that and understanding at that point in time, particularly the 1970s. And I think the narrative in Britain about whether you belong or don't belong here is very much tied around your citizenship and immigration, which is different to the Black Lives Matter movement that's taking place, and in the
very different.
Right at this moment in time, its roots are in slavery, in terms of people being forced labor, to develop, in terms of modernization and industrialization of the states. Britain's got a different history in terms of as a colonial, as a colonizer and colonial. It was very much we outsourced it elsewhere. So I think that's really important in terms of like immigration. And I think that's something about the context of understanding it here. You belong here or you don't. Your citizenship, having a passport. And that gets played out in terms of how then people see, what's happening here in terms of economic migrants, the good immigrant, the bad immigrant who abuses the benefits. There's all these narratives, which actually aren't true, and their purpose is to almost other us, people like me, if you and whether you belong here or not. So, I mean, that's something in terms of like the UK context. It's very much tied around different types of different immigration legislation that's been brought in to kind of manage numbers. I think it was Margaret Thatcher who said, we're going to be swamped. Although people like my dad's generation and people from the Commonwealth were invited here.
I know. And that's what we forget, isn't it?
Yeah, and it was very confusing on one hand for my dad and that particular generation, because they were also like, well, we want to live here. And at the same time, Dad was very mindful we might end up getting kicked out. So he built a house in Pakistan. It took him years to do it. But he was very mindful of the sense of belonging and being unwanted.
I think that is certainly the refugees sort of cross the bear, but it's also the immigrants cross the bear, isn't it? When will I be turfed out again? When will I be made to feel that I don't belong here anymore? And that's what, for me, is the tragedy, actually, of the last 3 years of life here in the UK. I mean, I'm just dismayed by it, to be honest, because so many people who, have been invited to come and have given so much, and we have we people like me have made those people feel so unwelcome. And that's my little soapbox. I better get off it quickly.
It's the system, because sometimes it's not, it's not you personally, you, Rachel.
I know.
But we have responsibility and we have agency about what actions and what we can do. But it's also about the system, that systemic racism, that systemic, it does discriminate against particular groups more than it does disproportionately more than others. And I think that's in terms of like the wider what's happened globally in the Black Lives Movement and actually within the UK are these conversations and types of internal organisational kind of soul searching about, well, actually, what's been our role within this? Do we support our, Black and ethnic minority staff? Do people feel safe to talk about their experiences? And you can then put that in terms of like an intersectional analysis around gender, class, age, gender identities, how, so it's, and I don't think things have changed now, which is great as well. And I think there's that space to have these conversations, but it's also about what's going to change, what's the institutional change is going to be. And they take, that's the tough stuff. I don't believe in a hostile environment, look in terms of the people who were deported, the Windrush generation, and so silently.
Shameful.
I want, and I'll say this, I want us to have open borders because I believe in that. I don't believe in this in a globalized world of this idea of, who's allowed to come here and who's not. And then when people do come here, particular groups, and I think this was amplified during COVID around, no recourse to public funds. People, well, actually, I want to live in a world where people do have, dignity, are allowed their dignity, and make choices in terms of when they come here, what they want to do with their lives, but not to be almost criminalized for it because they don't have the right paperwork. So that, I suppose, the activist in me, or the passionate activist in me, is this, like, there's a lot of work to be done here on those particular groups who are almost like invisible.
That's the issue, certainly for me, between racism in the US and racism in the UK. In the US, it's in front of your face, you can't ignore it. And you watch a documentary like The 13th and you realise that every single thing is set up to prejudice people of colour.
Yeah.
And in the UK, I think there's a lot of people who think, oh, well, that's America. We don't have those same sort of issues here. We don't have the same issues, but we have the same sorts of issues. Mm-hmm. But it's more hidden. It's slightly more insidious, I think, that it's underneath the surface. It's not you're full in your face, but it's just as damaging.
Yeah. It's those little subtle things that, I've experienced where you just know someone actually doesn't like you or has a sense of hatred, and it's a horrible feeling, but it's very visceral just because of what you look like or how they perceive you.
Does that still happen to you now?
Not as much. I mean, little things around, saying my name and, that kind of stuff. And I'm not, not about pronunciation, I just can't be bothered making the effort. And there's little, and it's just like, oh, wow, how do you say that? And so that's a little couple of, but no, not as profound or as kind of overt as I have in the past. And I still think about those experiences because a part of me thinks, did that person kind of very racially gendered abuse, very public? And I thought, actually, I wanted to go, I didn't want to get into a fight. But a part of me did. I had to think about my safety. It was one night my sister and I were coming back from being out, and a group of men basically started on us. And we could hear the abuse when we were like walking really fast away from them. And I just thought, actually, I don't think about it in terms of in a way of, oh, God, that trauma. But where I think about it is more around, did that person really realise what they were doing the next day? Mm. And I think that is the question about, and probably not.
Probably forgotten about it.
Probably forgotten about it. So and that was a long time ago, and that was in Edinburgh, but it was, it was like we were actually not safe at that point in time. So, but that might be partly because of the work I do, the space I'm in, as well. And I think it has changed. I don't think it's gone away, but I think it's changed. I think we have very amazing different generations who have a very different view of people and the world. And I think that's in very good ways. I think Brexit's going to be interesting when it does happen and what that's like. I know a lot of younger generation didn't want Brexit, and who knows when they start to vote, how that will pan out. It's interesting time ahead, actually.
And not to mention COVID.
Absolutely right. I was just about to say that. And we're still under a global pandemic. And I think that amplified hugely the structural and the inequalities impact, which had an impact hugely around, BAME communities, around underlying health conditions disproportionately affected, housing, social housing, intergenerational living. Also the areas of work that particular ethnic minority groups were in. You had them around care work within the NHS. So that was very profound. I think when Black Lives Matter was happening, seeing all the faces of different groups, very diverse group of people who sadly lost their lives due to COVID, but they were frontline. And the British Medical Journal, coming out saying there's concern, we need to safeguard particular, in terms of age, but also different ethnic minority groups, who may be more at risk, and could die due to COVID-19 symptoms. So that's, obviously we are in a pandemic, but it amplified so much.
And BAME communities are disproportionately represented in the NHS, aren't they? Because so many go into those caring professions.
Or doctors, nurses, care work, and all the different levels and types of roles and stuff. And so that's been, I think that, and actually seeing the data and seeing that, on some of the newspapers as kind of national headlines. Never happened before. No. And the context is very important. But it highlighted a lot of, economic inequality as well, why people were doing certain types of jobs. So that, and then also at the same time, I think I did have that sense of all these other people, in terms of increases of people being trapped in their own homes as well, in terms of around abuse, vulnerability, safeguarding people, all sorts of things. So that at first, that really affected me in terms of that level of suffering, not in a passive way, but more like, I want to do something. How can we support this? How do we continue to support this? Because we're still in a, lockdown. We're in all these different types of lockdowns nationally across, Britain, but also I don't think we've seen the economic impact.
Nah, it's coming. It's
coming. That's, but this, a lot of younger generation as well, in terms of going to university, work, college, so that's a thing that, I'm thinking, well, how is that going to impact on people's lives even?
Now, I first came across you because you were featured in a Scottish magazine, weren't you? Because you turned 50, as has Nicola Sturgeon this year. So I wanted to ask you, how do you feel about being in this time of life? And do you feel that you're getting even more concerned with these issues? Are you getting even more active as you get older? How does it feel being 50?
I absolutely love being 50. I really do. I turned 50 under lockdown. So my birthday was in May, I think 6 or 7 weeks into lockdown. And as ever, will always honour my, and think about my parents hugely, who we lost 13 years ago. a month apart. Mom passed away, and then Dad passed away exactly a month later of a broken heart. So at that time, there was a sense of, quite a profound sense of, that we've lost our parents, and this mum passed away due to Parkinson's related illness, and then we lost Dad literally a month later. So we were all very much reeling, but we also had this really profound sense of around life and death, and actually where next. That generation's gone. And a lot of their stories and experiences have gone with them, but they live on within us and their grandchildren. So that was a big part of my reflection in terms of, well, Mum always wanted to be a teacher, but would love to have been a teacher. But she was a girl child of partition at that point in time. There wasn't the opportunities. They were poor. There wasn't the structures. It was not there for her. It did not exist. So it was that kind of legacy, and Dad was very much committed to social justice and very kind. They were both very kind. So that, I reflected on that and them not being part of our lives. I think there's something about being 50 and for becoming freelance as well, doing more of the things I want to do and that I'm good at. I can't fit into a box anymore when I look at work opportunity.
Tell me about it.
I can't. And I wish I could, but I can't. And I'm just like, I'm qualified. I can't do that anymore. So there's something very liberating. It's also something very about understanding finances and financial stability when you are freelance as well, and really kind of working, getting my head around all of that. More active, yeah, or not as, definitely more active. I would say more in a way of, I want to help people who are very active, because I know what it's like to burn out when you're doing too much, when you're supporting different types of campaigns. Particularly, I think in Britain, there were particular kind of racist murders that happened across England and Scotland, and it was in the 80s, 90s. I mean, they still do in terms of, and there are charities that work around and support that, such as Inquest. But it was also around, what can I do more of? How do I contribute? And that's the space I'm in, about turning 50 now. What do I want to offer? Or what can I offer? And what can I offer well?
So what advice do you have for other midlife women who want to do something, want to do more, but don't really know where to start? You've been doing this all your life, and you had, the example of your parents, and it's always been important to you. I think a lot of women, it may have been important, but it wasn't a fixture of their life so much. But I do find that, as we get a bit older, we're more conscious of, how much time is left and what we want to do with that time and the impact we want to have. So what advice do you have for a woman who's thinking, okay, well, I want to do something, but I don't know what?
I would start with what are you really good at doing? What do you like doing? And it's not about it being paid or unpaid. What do you like doing, and what do you want to do more of? And do you want to work more with people? Do you want to mentor? I mean, they're just, examples. Is your skill set in your life experience? I think particularly life experience. Are you able to kind of coach somebody, mentor? Do you need it yourself? And I think that's an important thing, I would say, for women who are in that space. Don't be afraid, or not afraid, but quiet about wanting to reach out to other people. In terms of on Twitter or somebody and say, look, can we have a chat?
Like I did to you.
Yeah. But I do find that generosity of spirit amongst women, and I think the older we get, there's that wisdom, growing our own wisdom. I call it growing my own wisdom. It's not necessarily the same as experience. It's just like lessons learnt, and surrounding yourself with, I think, a really good group of people who are your backup. I really believe in backup, who got your back. And if you're not sure about something, maybe there's worth, speaking to, people like yourself, Rachel, or, other people out there who are, because sometimes we don't have words for what we necessarily want to do, or we have a sense of it, but we sometimes just need to have a conversation with somebody and say, look, I'm a little bit stuck here, or I'm a little bit, and I don't think women at this stage of life are necessarily stuck. I think sometimes, or underconfident or unsure. I think it's just being a bit brave and saying, I'm just going to take that little step and see where it takes me. It might not be the one I end up eventually, going from one step to another, but I'll see where I land and take it from there.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife Podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, share it, and leave me a review wherever you're listening. It really helps me get the message out. You can find out more information about this episode in the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you'll find strategies, support, and resources to help make your midlife magnificent. Get clarity on how to make the most of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.